Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Political Incorrectors podcast. I am your co-host Eric,
and I am your co-host Luke,
and we're so happy to be back with another episode. In this episode, guys, we're going to be talking about an array of different topics pertaining to current affairs at this time. We're going to start, I think, with talking about the polls and what the polls indicate in terms of popularity for political parties. We're then going to get on to the Dublin Bay South election, by-election, that is occurring on the 8th of July. We're going to be talking a bit about that and what we think might occur in terms of the victor of the election, who might win. We're then going to go on to talk a bit about the DUP and the fact that the party up north, the DUP, might be in disrepute. We're going to talk about Edwin Poots, his resignation and his likely successor. We're then going to talk about students and how students have been mistreated in terms of the public arena regarding comments made about students relating to the PUP payment, and some decisions that have been made relating to the PUP payment and students and SUSI for the next academic year. Then we're going to conclude talking about the great debate, the vote at 16 debate. A lot of political, I think, rhetoric has arisen recently in regards to extending the suffrage to young people, to 16-year-olds. So Luke and I are going to talk about that too. So starting with the polls, Luke, that indicate political popularity for some parties, what do you think of the recent Irish Times poll that we saw?
Yes, well, as you said, we have a lot to talk about today, but I think this is a good thing to start with because I think it gives us a good kind of snapshot in time of where Irish politics is at the minute. And I suppose this last Irish Times poll was, I don't know, was it a bit of a surprise, but it gave record support to Sinn Féin, which was interesting, and saw a slight decrease in support for Fine Gael. And I might go through the figures just so people know what we're talking about. The main figures were, so there was 30% support for Sinn Féin, and that was a 3% rise from the last poll. 27% support for Fine Gael and a 3% decrease from the last poll. And 20% for Fianna Fáil, which is a 6% increase from the last poll. So I guess the figure that stands out there is 31% for Sinn Féin, and what seems to be record support for Sinn Féin. And I guess I'm wondering, we've known that voter support has gone to Sinn Féin a lot recently since the 2020 general election, but I do wonder what has led people to prefer Sinn Féin at this moment in time. I guess one of the biggest issues at the minute, outside of COVID-19, is housing. There's been a lot of anger and disappointment about housing. That seems to be the issue, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely does. I think during the midst of the general election in 2020, the main issues that I think a lot of politicians heard on the doorsteps, according to what we saw in the media anyways, was housing and health. And at this time, those issues have not evaporated. Now, COVID has arrived and it's definitely diverted our attention to different things, but there's still an issue when it comes to the housing system here in Ireland, or at least how housing goes down in regards to affordability in places like Dublin, and then that links with homelessness and also health. So the waiting list problem has not substantially been improved, and I think as long as these underlying issues exist, and those underlying issues were the ones that got people to vote for Sinn Féin en masse in the last general election, then it's hard to see support for Sinn Féin dwindling, because I think one successful but easy tactic Sinn Féin used on the campaign trail, and many other parties that weren't Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, was they associated with these issues regarding health and housing to Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. And I think they can rightfully be associated with the two parties to a great extent, because those are the parties in charge dealing with those two systems, and those portfolios were dreaded by many ministers because of how hard it was to sort out those problems. And there's an argument to be made that the ideological approach taken to both issues have not been good in terms of solving the problems that exist there, but also the rational alternative to those two parties, I think in the eyes of voters in the 2020 general election, was Sinn Féin, and those issues still exist, and therefore support for Sinn Féin naturally, in my opinion, still exists. But this is the only correlation I can draw as to why they've done so well, and the government parties have been lacking relative to Sinn Féin in the polls.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose the biggest issue at the minute is COVID. It's what we hear about in the news every day. But if you look at that poll, 7 out of 10 voters, so that's 70%, said that the government is doing a good job in handling the pandemic. So it's clear that isn't the issue. So I think you're right. It is housing. Housing hasn't really got any better since the general election. I I guess there's a lot of hopelessness with the issue because, I mean, there's been the generation has been labelled Generation Rent. You know, this generation of people who, up until they're like nearly 40, can't afford a house. They have to live with their parents. They have to sofa surf from house to house with their friends. And that's and pay like extortionate rents, massive rents, which takes up a massive fraction of their income. So that's, you can see where that anger comes from, and you can see why they're attracted to Sinn Féin, because they've really they've positioned themselves as the party to take on Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and be the change, and that's how they won the election, really, wasn't it? They said they were the party of change. I think it's interesting as well. I read an article last week by David McWilliams, and he was speaking about, you know, in Europe, where maybe working class people and increasingly middle class people who are squeezed have voted for right wing parties, anti establishment parties, but the exception seems to be Ireland, where that kind of anti establishment vote, that angry vote, that maybe populist vote, has gone to Sinn Féin. And I think they've done a really good job, in fairness to them, of positioning themselves as that party of change. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that pans out. Interestingly, though, we did, like when we spoke before, we pointed this out as well, that was the party support, but when you look at the support for leaders and the satisfaction with leaders, it's slightly different. And you see Taoiseach Leo Varadkar top that poll with 56% satisfaction with his leadership. Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, 49%, and Mary Lou, leader of Sinn Féin, 42%. What is that about? What do you think?
Yeah, it's hard to really grasp the contradiction. I can't, personally speaking, anyways. I like to firstly appreciate that you mentioned the pun Generation Rent. I think relative to other European countries, a particularly high number of young people here in Ireland live with their parents, and that can partly be attributed to housing policies that haven't necessarily been helpful when it comes to solving the housing issue. But back to the contradiction, Leo Varadkar, as you said, is ahead in the poll, as you said, with 56%, Micheál Martin 49%, Eamon Ryan 26%, Mary Lou McDonald 42%. So that's a considerable drop from 56%, Mary Lou at 42% and Leo Varadkar at 56%. And I don't know, I can't really fathom it. I think I'd probably attribute it to the praise Varadkar received when he was Taoiseach at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic's wrath. And when it first arrived, he was a Taoiseach. I remember the press conferences being accepted generally well by the public, from what I saw in the media and what I heard in our locality, Longford. The speeches he gave, I think, were accepted and embraced by many. And of course, right before, I think, the pandemic's existence prolonged in a crucial and terrible way for the public, Micheál Martin came to the helm of leadership in Ireland, and he had to bear the brunt of a lot of things that were within and without his control. So that could have helped Varadkar in terms of his public image in the context of COVID-19. But I don't understand. There's possibly 100 things we can attribute it to. Mary Lou McDonald, I think she's fantastic. You and I are advocates of more menace and more women in politics. So is there views related to that in terms of why they don't support her? Maybe if Sinn Féin support is entirely a protest against the establishment, if that's what it entirely is, then it isn't necessarily for the characters within the party. Rather, it's just for an expression of dissatisfaction and disillusionment in terms of the status quo. So yeah, that could probably be, I think, the best reason why I'd say her support isn't spiraling compared to the two other men, Micheál Martin and Leo Varadkar. But it's an interesting contradiction for sure.
Yeah, really interesting, and I do think you're right. Like, you know, Leo Varadkar is someone who is a very good communicator. I think he puts a lot of effort into his communication, into his message, into his image. He's been quite good on social media recently. He goes live on Instagram a lot. He seems to have put a lot of effort into that. And he likes to get, you know, the exclusive when it comes to going to the press with issues about like reopening of society and restaurants and stuff like that. So I wonder, is that poll a sign of his visibility, of maybe his personal likability? I think there's an element of that to it. But I think a point that you raised about Sinn Féin, it being less about Mary Lou McDonald and the personalities in the party and more about the issues. I do think we're moving towards a more issue-based politics, and I think people maybe support Sinn Féin because they see them as best placed to take on housing and health, rather than they have the best personalities, maybe it might be the case. But I think this leads us on nicely to a question we want to ask too, that we touched on previously in the podcast. What would a Sinn Féin government look like? What would Sinn Féin in charge of our society, in charge of our government, look like? What changes would they bring about? That begs that question. What do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting question for sure. I think there was a lot of excitement, particularly amongst young people in the last election that voted for Sinn Féin. It felt like you were voting against, again, all the, I think, terrible things, terrible aspects of the flawed systems that we speak of in terms of housing and health, all the terrible social issues that exist that plague the lives of a lot of people, all of the inequality that I think our generation has become so accustomed to speaking against. Sinn Féin was that rational alternative in the eyes of a lot of us. So I think that young people based energy, that youthful energy, I think it would work for Sinn Féin to pick it up if they did arrive at government, to serve the interests of the young people that definitely want to see a change when it comes to how things are going. I think also that undeniably be an ideological change when it comes to how we do health and housing because of Sinn Féin's natural position on the political spectrum. And for me, we haven't gotten to see an alternative approach to housing and health. And I definitely desire that. Now, does that change have to come in the form of a new political party? Not necessarily, but I think there does need to be a change when it comes to how we do it. I think an example with Darragh O'Brien's, our housing minister's recent legislation, the bill he introduced on housing, the equity scheme, I think it was called. Its aim was to put more money in the hands of people to reach the exorbitant rents in Dublin. But I think what we need to be working to do, and I think David McWilliams, you mentioned him earlier, he's talked about this a lot, is working to manipulate the housing prices so that they can meet the interest of renters and the capacity of renters rather than feeding into the status quo system. And Sinn Féin and Owen O'Brien in the area of housing, he definitely espouses this message. He even had an Instagram live with David McWilliams, which is something I never thought I'd see a political candidate do or politician do, because it's not favourable to have a really well-known, well-versed economist on to talk about policy because it might contradict what you want. So there will be an ideological shift. Whether that will be good is hard to tell, but there needs to be a change. During the election, the hustings, I think, I forget what program it was on. I think it was 3. I'm not too sure, but it was a leaders' hustings. And Mary Lou McDonald was asked to comment on housing. I remember her speaking about supply, and supply, I think, is the fundamental issue amongst other things. And she was asked, how will we bring about an increase in housing in Dublin and in areas where housing is needed and supply is needed. And she talked about returning workers that have went abroad, builders that are abroad to build. You know, that's you putting your claims into question empirically. And when that occurs, that answer simply is not sufficient. So I think this definitely speaks to how the change we seek. There might not be Moses or like a savior or Robin Hood when it comes to these issues. It might be difficult, and the change that we think is needed might not be what is actually needed. So it'll be interesting. Lastly, the issue that I have spoke about in the past in this podcast that I'm concerned about, especially after speaking to some people in Northern Ireland, is a united Ireland. I've spoken to people in Northern Ireland recently who are not politically inclined, who are apolitical very much, especially when it comes to party politics, who do not care who's in charge, but who do care about peace, who are told stories about their parents every day about the troubles and about what occurred, and who have lost family members too. And these people don't care about political visions per se, rather they care about peace. Some of them would like it to see a united Ireland, some of the people I spoke to, but they don't care about hastily bringing about if this jeopardizes the peace process. And I think Sinn Féin drive for united Ireland, and I've said this before on the podcast, if it's not holistically implemented in tandem with the principles of the Good Friday Agreement and the principles of activists like John Hume, I don't think that's good for Ireland, in my personal opinion. If you don't think of the real consequences of United Ireland, and rather you want the consequences to be in line with your political vision, I simply can't see that being good. So this is definitely something that worries me about a Sinn Féin government. But yes, this is mainly, we need a change. A party political change might not be what we think we need, especially if viewpoints and claims are not viable and cannot be verified, like the whole idea of bringing back builders. How achievable is that? And lastly, it might be good, but a United Ireland needs to be implemented holistically, not in a way based on the ambitions of the ideologue. I don't think that's good for anyone per se. But what do I know? What do you think a Sinn Féin
Well,
government might look like?
you touched on so much there, and I mean, I agree with every bit of it. Like, that was gold dust. Like, I really agree so much with that. Um, I guess, the question, what would Sinn Féin look like in government? There's no doubt about it. It would be a change. What type of change would it be? I don't know. It would certainly look different. It would certainly feel different. It would be the first time in the history of the state we've had a government led by any other party than Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Would they fix the big issues of the day? Would they fix housing? There's no doubt about it again. Owen O'Brien is a really impressive person, really impressive communicator and politician. Is he equipped to solve the housing crisis? As you said, it seems to be like a supply side issue. Can he build houses? Can he build thousands of houses? That would be very interesting. Look at a report published by, albeit Fine Gael today, I think. It pointed to Sinn Féin objecting to 6,000 houses being built in Dublin recently for ideological reasons. They didn't agree with how they were being built and why they were being built in the places they were at the prices they were being built at. At the same time, if you're serious about fixing housing supply, why would your party vote against 6,000 houses in Dublin being built? That confuses me. And would we see more of that in government? I'd be really interested to see how that would happen. Health as well. I wonder how they'd fix health. There is a cross-party support for Sláinte Care in the Dáil, which is a new vision for health and how our health system could work, definitely. And then another thing I wanted to point out, actually, that you didn't touch on, again, was recently in the Dáil, Sinn Féin didn't show up for a vote on the Offences Against the State bill, which basically it covers terrorism, serious crimes, and the Special Criminal Court, which is a court that doesn't have a jury but has, I think, 3 judges, because of the fear of what would happen if a dissident Republican group or a serious crime group threatened jury members that were sitting in on those trials, and that's a serious concern. Now we can have a reasonable discussion about this, but to not show up to the Dáil on a vote on the Special Criminal Court, so they didn't come to abstain, they didn't come to vote for, or they didn't come to vote against. They walked out of the chamber. I have to wonder, what would Sinn Féin do in government when it comes to reinstating the Offences Against the State Act? Would they just not show up to the Dáil for the day as the government? I mean, what would they do? I'm genuinely fascinated. And to see a party who want to be in government and who call themselves the most effective opposition in the state not show up to the Dáil for a really important piece of legislation doesn't exactly fill me with hope, but look, they could still bring about change. And then finally, on your point about United Ireland, look, I mean, I would describe myself as a Republican. I'd love to see a United Ireland in my lifetime. But at the same time, Sinn Féin's approach, and I think this is what kind of gets lost in translation sometimes when you focus on housing, when you focus on health, rightly, because they're the big issues of the day. Sinn Féin wanted a border poll in United Ireland as soon as possible. As soon as possible. That's all well and good, but I have to wonder, what, and maybe I'm completely ignorant to this, but what work have they done on shaping a new Ireland, a 32 county Ireland? What engagement have they done? What have they thought about, a new parliament, a new flag, a new healthcare system, a new education system? Where are these conversations and where are these policies? I'd be genuinely interested. Where's that conversation happening? Because from all I can see is that it's let's have a border poll now. It's not what will this new Ireland look like? A shared community of unionists and and nationalists, an entirely new state. I'm not seeing that, and I'd be fascinated again to see what their approach to that question would be in government in Dublin. It would certainly be an interesting government, Eric. That's for sure.
Yeah. Oh gosh, you brought the heat. Those are really, I think, good faith and substantial critiques. And these are questions that need to be answered. Oh goodness me, where to begin? I think on the point regarding a new Ireland. John Hume has a famous quote where he says, people don't eat flags. He said his dad once told him, people don't eat flags. So if we are going to envision a united Ireland, you touch on it brilliantly, we have to think of a new healthcare system. We have to think of how people are going to get food on the table. We have to think of how we're going to tackle issues like poverty. We have to think of the physiological needs that you have to think of when you're running a nation state, and how that might become more difficult to address in a united Ireland, or possibly more easier depending on the view you want to take. So yes, I think this should be our primary concern, and I know Sinn Féin, and I know you touched on it in our last episode. They released a document on how a united Ireland would be good for the Irish economy in large. So maybe they are considering these things, but we need our considerations to be as objective as possible. We need to be honest with them, because lives are going to be affected, and we need to lead on that basis. And I think a border poll right now, I'm not necessarily expressing a viewpoint on whether I think it's good or bad, but considering the dynamics surrounding Brexit, the dynamics surrounding COVID, and the potential of something like Brexit to cause, and the Northern Ireland Protocol to cause more hassle in the north, is a border poll at this time good? I think that's an important question to ask. But yeah, I think you said it perfectly by saying that a change is needed. And Sinn Féin's brand of change, I think, really speaks to a lot of the fears of people, particularly young people. I think the vibrancy that a lot of us associate with Sinn Féin sees them positioning themselves nicely. So going forward, they can definitely utilize this. But when it comes to applying wishes, we definitely need to see something that's verifiable and good, and that's applicable, and that can empirically work. I think on the point of housing, the main reason, I think, from what I've seen, Sinn Féin objecting housing is the building of houses is particularly because of who owns the houses. I know recently there's been lots of opposition to the influence of cuckoo funds in the housing market and private owners who raise the rent quite high. So the likes of O'Brien have spoke vehemently and passionately against this because of the fact that these houses are under government control and public control. Then the prices don't soar too highly. Yeah. I can't per se at this time speak about technically whether that's a good move, but I will say that if supply is the main issue, why oppose the supply? Technically, I can't necessarily criticize the objection, but I can say that lives are affected by whatever move politicians take. So people have to be at the heart of whatever we do, and not ideological leanings. And this applies to Sinn Féin as well as Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and all other parties.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, speaking about polls and government and change, I think that leads us on nicely to our next area of discussion, and that's the by-election that is happening in the Dublin Bay South constituency on Thursday the 8th of July. And the by-election is to fill the seat of the former Fine Gael Minister for Housing, Owen Murphy, who resigned his seat to work in international human rights. He got a new job. He was sick of politics because of the lifestyle and for a number of other reasons, which we might get into at a future date, because he made some good points. But the big event is this election, right? The candidates are, for Fine Gael, Councillor James Geoghegan; for Sinn Féin, Senator Lynn Boylan, who's a former MEP; Fianna Fáil, Councillor Deirdre Conroy; Green Party, Councillor Claire Byrne, who surprisingly, I think, in my opinion, beat Hazel Chu for the convention for the nomination for her party. So that's an interesting one. For Labour, Senator Ivana Bacik; and for the Social Democrats, Sarah Durkin, and there's some more, but they seem to be the main ones. It's going to be a really interesting election, Eric, I think. It's a Fine Gael stronghold. I think it's going to be interesting to see, can Sinn Féin perform well there? Could there be a dark horse in the election? But I think the question we want to ask, and predictions are dodgy, but how do you think it'll go? What do we think?
Yeah, looking at the indicators that I'm privy to, as you said, historically speaking, Fine Gael have performed very well. It's a Fine Gael TD giving up his seat after all. There's a Labour TD in that constituency. I think there's a Green Party TD. Eamon Ryan comes from that constituency also. So there's clearly bipartisan acceptance in the constituency. Judging based on the history, it definitely would point towards Fine Gael. However, you have to also consider national polls, I would argue, and considering that means that Sinn Féin may perform particularly well. Now, I don't know the demographic makeup of the support for Sinn Féin, and whether it'd naturally fall into places like the Dublin Bay South constituency. However, you have to consider the national polls and how that might play a part in mitigating and deciding the winner. Lastly, there are some household names on that. I think all of the candidates are fantastic in their own ways, and they all represent something different. We have the likes of Bridget Purcell for BBP, who's espouses more of a left-wing message articulately, and then we have the likes of James Geoghegan from Fine Gael, who's great. He looks vibrant and young also. But I think the likes of Lynn Boylan cannot be overlooked. They are established names in politics. And then also Ivana Basic. She's been around doing fantastic work for quite a while with the Labour Party too. I think she's played a prominent role in the campaign to promote the naturalization of migrants born here in Ireland. She played a very significant role in that area too. So, considering the household names, the history, and the polls, it is hard to see who wins. My common sense is telling me to point towards James Gogan only because of the history, but I don't think we should sleep on Lynn Boylan or Ivana Basic either because they're established names. So, yeah, maybe Ivana Basic, the dark horse, she'll submerge and be the winner. Who knows?
So is that your final answer, Eric? Ivana Basic?
Yeah. Okay. Let's get it on the record. Okay. My final answer.
it's locked in there. Yeah. Definitely. I think your points. You're dead right with a lot of that. For sure. I did miss Bridget Purcell, by the way. I forgot to mention her. Seems like a very interesting candidate. One thing that stands out, kind of side note. Lots and lots of women. Which is we love to see. More Mana, as you said earlier. Absolutely brilliant to see women putting their name forward, getting on the ticket and running. Brilliant slate of candidates, really impressive. Look, I think all arrows point to Fine Gael, to James Geoghegan. I'm going to say James Geoghegan. Could be wrong. I make a lot of predictions and a lot of them are wrong. I'm going to go with James Geoghegan, but I'm going to put a kind of wild card, definitely, on Ivana Basic. I think she has a really good national profile. She's a very articulate, strong candidate. And as well as that, I can see a lot of because in a by-election transfers come into play, right? Even more so than a general election. I see a lot of transfers going from Fine Gael to Ivana Basic and from Sinn Féin and pretty much every other party to Ivana Basic. So I think she'll be transfer friendly. It's just a matter, I guess, of how many first preference votes she gets. So definitely a strong possibility. But I'm going to go with James Geoghegan as my prediction. And we will revisit that at a later date and see how it goes. That should be interesting for sure. But yeah, going to be an interesting election to watch, definitely.
For sure. I'm really excited to see how that ends up. I guess we can then quickly segue into our next topic, which is certainly an interesting topic. It's not related to affairs we're privy to, but rather up north, particularly within the party we refer to as a Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP. So I'm sure many people might be aware of the fact that the DUP's leader a few months ago, Arlene Foster, then leader, was ousted. There was a coup d'etat within the party to remove her stake in the leadership. I think what sparked that move, of many factors, was her position on conversion therapy. She abstained on a vote on conversion therapy, the majority of her party actually supporting conversion therapy. And she was ousted because of that. Afterwards, Edwin Poots was appointed as the leader to allow you to know a bit about his personal background. He served on the executive as a health minister, I think, for a while. He comes from a farming agricultural background. He's a creationist, so he believes the world was created 6,000 years ago, believes that Adam and Eve were the first people in the world, which is quite interesting, He also has taken what I would describe as problematic positions when it comes to a lot of LGBT issues. He's been against the transfer of blood from gay men. He's also been against the idea of gay couples being able to adopt children too. He was vehemently against the Northern Irish Protocol, and he is also a vehement prod unionist. So this is the person that was leading the DUP. He ran into a stumbling block recently when he appointed Paul Davitt, I believe that's his name, MLE, as the First Minister. Him doing that saw him being unpopular in his party, and that, amongst other factors, led to him resigning as the leader of the DUP. So that's a lot to have occurred within one party in the last few months, and I think the DUP is kind of in disrepute considering that chronology. So yeah, what do you think of the matter anyways, Luke, and everything leading up to it? I think it's quite chaotic, to be honest.
Yeah, chaotic for sure. Like, a lot has happened. I mean, where to start with the DUP? It seems like a party In free fall at the minute, it seems like there's a lot of bad blood there. Certainly going to be fascinating to see where the party goes from now. I think in the first instance, Arlene Foster, while I disagree with her on so many issues, probably most issues, I do think she was a good leader. She was relatively charismatic. She carried herself well. Great to see a woman in charge of unionism or the DUP for sure, a key head figure in the unionist community. But to see her being thrown out effectively, because she abstained, didn't even vote against or for conversion therapy, which is, I mean, can only be described as a form of abuse to change gay people from being gay to straight. The DUP apparently saw that as it's open season, go for it if you want, which, I mean, is hard to believe in the 21st century on this island. Compare that to attitudes south of the border. I mean, that just wouldn't float here. So it's really disappointing to see that attitude alive and well there. I guess there were other issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol and Brexit and how that was handled that made people really unhappy with her. She was gone. Then we had Edwin Poots, who was just a fascinating individual entirely. I mean, creationist, doesn't believe dinosaurs were real, which, I mean, look, I don't want to laugh at him, but that's interesting. Like, I mean, it's an anti-science position. Kind of interesting to see how he led. He led the biggest party in Northern Ireland after all that. But I mean, to add to the chaos, he only lasted 21 days, and he was gone again because there was the issue with Paul Givan, I think, was who he appointed First Minister, and he kind of softened up, or laid the road open for the Irish Language Act, and there was a lot of issues there, and bit by bit it all just fell apart. So it's been chaotic, I mean, to put it mildly. And I think the observation is it's just going to be fascinating to see where unionism goes from here, where the DUP goes from here. It seems like Jeffrey Donaldson, who's an MP in Westminster representing the DUP, will be the new leader of the DUP. He's the only one who ran. Seems to be a little bit more moderate than Edwin Poots was, so it's going to be, again, interesting to see how he leads the party. But I think all eyes will be on the next Stormont elections in the north, because it seems like support for the DUP could dwindle, while support for Sinn Féin seems to be relatively higher, and support for the Alliance Party, which is a party who don't take a position on the constitutional question of nationalist and unionist. It seems like they could receive a lot of support. So developments in the north are going to be really interesting over the next few months, and it's an issue that I hope, as we spoke about United Ireland earlier, we can talk about more on this podcast, in this space, and feature voices from the north, from all communities and none, hopefully, to have these conversations, because it's going to be really interesting. So yeah, fascinating few weeks and months in the north, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a topic, as Luke said, guys, that we're going to be working to delve into going forward into the future. I think the question of a United Ireland and our relations with the north down here in the south is very important. Again, from listening to some people talk from the north, they always talk about how ignorant a lot of people from the south are as to the dynamics, political and social and cultural dynamics in the north. Anytime they speak to the people in the south, there's so much about the lived realities of those in the north that they don't know. So I think as we propose our ideological visions, be that of a United Ireland or an Ireland that remains the way it is, we have to ensure they are centered on sentiments and the feelings of people in the south. To some extent, yes, but to a greater extent, I would argue the people in the north will have to live the reality of our decisions. So yeah, I think we can now nicely move the conversation on to students. And the way students were talked about recently, especially in regards to the PUP payment. I know a lot of disparaging comments were made about students, and they were made out to be people who just wanted to cheat the system and avail of PUP payments in a way that was not in line with common decency and without respect for the institutions that guarantee the PUP payments. In addition to this, I'd like to mention that Simon Harris, Minister for Higher Education, recently said that students that did benefit from the PUP payments will not per se be judged as they would have before the introduction of PUP when it comes to deciding how much of the SUSI grant they receive. The SUSI grant is a grant that students receive to help them with navigating student life, and as students they receive this grant to help them move forward as students. It helps with accommodation, with your food and the like, and achieving your educational aspirations and goals. So because students availed of the PUP payment in the past, which is a pandemic unemployment payment paid to citizens who were unemployed during the pandemic, because of the pandemic, students that avail of that will now be judged in terms of the financial threshold in a way that accounts for the PUP payment. Now, the student argument, and I can argue based on my own experiences, I'm sure you can, Luke, too, and many other students out there, is that, look, the SUSI payment is not good enough as it is. I can barely survive. I can barely exist on SUSI, let alone achieve my educational aspirations. Like, what is education when I'm going a day without food and eating, I don't know, Cocoa Pops for lunch, dinner, breakfast? So it's not per se good enough as it is. So the PUP payment was a breath of fresh air to some students because it allowed them to alleviate the burden of COVID and alleviate the burden of student life. And now our grant might be reduced based on the fact that we avail of the PUP payment. I think on paper, in theory, it sounds rational. You know, you've availed of this, people, so let it go when it comes to this grant, because some people are in a more disadvantaged predicament. I completely understand that. In theory, you know, good. However, in practice, it definitely manifests itself in a different way. Because if you look at the experiences of a lot of students, it was tough on SUSI. If you look at the experiences on PUP, it was still tough, but less tough. So reducing the SUSI grant based on how much people gain from PUP, I think, is anti-student to a great extent, and is not empathetic to the realities and the experiences and the lives of a lot of students and the financial position of that is inherently precarious that a lot of students are in. So yeah, this would be my opinion, and I'd say the backlash online was just so disingenuous, lacked empathy, and it was very sad to see that from a lot of older people who did not understand why students, I guess, availed of PUP. And I'm not saying that in terms of the illegalities that people spoke of, but rather in terms of the lived experience, which is not pleasant.
Yeah, and I think it all points to this kind of narrative that's been out there since the start of the pandemic, that, you know, students and young people, they don't care, they're lazy, they're the cause of all the world's problems. That's been dramatic, but it does seem that young people are kind of like a piñata that's hit by a lot of people, particularly online, particularly, you know, some media headlines, an easy target to take anger and frustration out on. But I mean, in my experience, students, apart from like some who are doing bad things when they shouldn't be, have been perfectly fine throughout this pandemic. They've followed the rules like everyone else. And you know, even when the PUP first came into existence, students who have lost their jobs, people said, why should students get, I think it was €350 a week at first, why should they get that when they only made, you know, €140 a week before? As if students, you know, don't have it hard enough. As you said, SUSI barely covers the costs, so God forbid they got a bit extra money because they lost their job, their minimum wage job, more than likely in retail. God forbid. Your points about SUSI are dead right. I mean, it's a system that's supposed to make education accessible and affordable for people. The $3,000 fees covered is brilliant. I mean, we can't fault that. That's a brilliant. It really opens the door up. But in terms of covering the cost of living, it really doesn't do it. Especially for cities like Galway, like Dublin, and Cork. It just doesn't cover the cost of living. Accommodation takes a vast majority. It doesn't cover that nearly. Education costs, and then God forbid you want to have a social life or like enjoy yourself as well. It's just it doesn't cover that cost at all, and it needs to change, because like education is a human right. It shouldn't cost so much to go to college and educate yourself, to make this country inevitably a better place by bringing your education to the fore and entering the workforce. It just it needs to change. I hope the attitude to students changes as we go on, but ultimately, again, I think just disappointing narratives, disappointing stories, that I hope change eventually.
Absolutely. You put it perfectly there. And we can tie that into so much in terms of the public perceptions here in Ireland. It can be tied to the Leaving Cert and how a lot of young people have protested the Leaving Cert in its traditional form, and a lot of people, because of the generational gap as to how we perceive the Leaving Cert, are okay with it. One thing you've always said to me, Luke, is you've talked about our vicious, violent, psychotic relationship with the Leaving Cert here in Ireland. We see it as this kind of army boot camp period of toughness that you go through and brag about how it was so bad and it was terrible, but I got through it at the end. And you take pride in the fact that the experience was so hard. I think this characterizes a lot of sentiment around the Leaving Cert from people who are not young people who are experiencing the Leaving Cert. So that when young people complain about it, I think there's just a condescending attitude manifested in that moment towards young people. And another issue that I termed the great debate earlier on is vote at 16. There's been also talk about this recently. Thomas Byrne, I think, forwarded a motion on vote at 16 recently, and a lot of public debate and commentary has been espoused around the issue recently. So do you want to talk about how do you feel about vote at 16?
Yes, it was Thomas Pringle, who is an independent TD from Donegal, who introduced a bill in the Dáil.
Sorry, Thomas Pringle. It was Thomas Pringle.
He introduced a bill in the Dáil a couple of months ago, a referendum bill, which basically would bring about a referendum that asked the public whether they think the voting age should be reduced from 18 to 16 in all elections. And I suppose that triggered a debate that's been had lots of times over the last few years about whether the voting age should be reduced to 16. Personally, I think absolutely. It's an issue that I've worked on a lot through the Irish Second Level Students' Union and other places. I think it makes sense. Young people deserve a say in how the country is run. They deserve a say in issues that affect them. And I think 16, 17, when they're still in school, likely in TY 5th, 6th year, perfect time to introduce real, useful political education and voter education. To teach them how to register to vote, how to figure out how proportional representation works, and ultimately encourage people to get into polling booths and vote for the people that represent them, and tell them why it matters. Otherwise, at 18, 19, you're kind of moving away from your community, and maybe voting isn't a priority. I think get people when they're still at home, when they still care about their community, when they still notice issues in their community and in their constituency. I think it's the perfect time to vote. Others would definitely argue plenty of other ways, but I think to me it's common sense, and I'd love to see it as soon as possible.
Yeah, that was well articulated, Luke. Honestly, I think you put it perfectly, and I'm actually going to address some in terms of the kind of condescending attitude from many when it comes to vote at 16. I'm going to address that now. A senator actually said, Senator Mary Louise O'Donnell, she said it at the time, she was an independent senator at the time, and I think you were in the Oireachtas at this time, Luke, when she said this. It was a public gallery full of teenagers. I'm actually getting this from an article from the Irish Times, and she said, "Stay away from politics," to the young people present during a debate on the issue. She said, "I would suggest you continue to get on with your education, your travel, arts, romance, music expression, and sport." So this was her advice to young people when it came to the issue of politics. And I think on this point of condescension, which is how I'll term it, because that's all it is in my eyes, I think it really clashes with a lot of the work and fervour that young people have represented over the past few years here in Ireland. Not only have young people been at the front line of a lot of campaigns that have guaranteed a lot of rights here in Ireland and overturned a lot of regressive laws and legal realities, they've also pushed a lot of ideas and positions in regards to Ireland's future that is inherently beneficial to Ireland. When we look at the BLM protests last year, it was young people of all races and backgrounds on the streets. If we look at Fridays for Future, it was young people of all ages and backgrounds here in Ireland on the streets too. If we look at the 8th Amendment, to vote on that, if we look at the guarantee of equal marriage, it was young people heavily involved in the process of changing that. So advising young people who played a significant part in these campaigns to stay away from these campaigns might not have changed the reality that existed prior to these reforms and revolutionary changes in the way that it occurred. In Scotland, they actually extended the suffrage to 16 and 17-year-olds to vote on constitutional issues, and this actually increased youth participation when it came to young people voting in politics. So prior to that, youth turnout was low. After they extended the right to vote to young people, it actually surpassed the voting turnout for 16 and 17-year-olds was higher than that for 18 and 24-year-olds. It was 75% for 16 and 17-year-olds, and it was 54% for 18 and 24-year-olds. In terms of academic commentary around this, Dr. Theresa Reedy, from the same article from the Irish Times, who's a political scientist at UCC. She said it feels like change will come likely when it comes to the issue, and that if you look throughout history, people because of their race were denied the right to vote. People because of their sex and gender and economic background were denied the right to vote. So naturally, there'll be an extension of the suffrage to young people. So it makes sense if you look at it chronologically speaking. And lastly, I will say that the professor of politics, I think at Cambridge University, David Runciman, I might be mispronouncing his name, he suggests that the voting age should be lowered to the age of 6. He thinks that it'll give democracy, our ailing democracy, a jolt of energy that is needed. And he said the final frontier of enfranchisement, or the final frontier in terms of the extension of the suffrage to vote, is children. So he's talking about how that chronology and how it should naturally extend to children too. So this is professional sentiment. I will say that in terms of critiques, you mentioned it there, Luke, I haven't seen any, and my mind is open, and I know yours is too, substantial critiques of extending the suffrage to 16 and 17-year-olds. You hear that 16-year-olds aren't able to do particular things, which is completely okay. But being in the army, how is that an indicator of your political perspective? Not being able to drink alcohol, how is that an indicator of your political capacity? It simply makes no sense. There's just a stigma around the age, and we're not looking at the potential of lowering the voting age and what that might do to our democracy. I know there's the impressionable argument that young people are impressionable and are susceptible to populism. What about the 20th century and all of the old people that voted in despots who ruined countries and took the lives of millions of people? I simply don't get it. I don't understand it. I think there's a conservative, not with a lowercase c, attitude towards it that isn't helpful to young people involved or to the country, quite frankly, and it's not open to change.
Yeah, you're so right. And I think the issue is, like, when you hear lower the voting age to 16, it's an issue that, like, immediately when it hits you, when you hear it on the news or when someone says it to you in the street, you're like, oh God, no, that couldn't work. Especially if you're an adult, that doesn't make sense because the voting age has been 18 for so long. And that's just something that's stuck in my mind, that's, you vote when you're 18. It doesn't have to be that way. And when you use arguments like, oh, they're not old enough, or, they're not mature enough, or they don't know enough, it's just like, with respect, they're not good enough arguments. I think people are perfectly mature. They you do CSP in school. Young people are on social media. They know more than a lot of people did at the age of 16 and 17 in generations past. As we said, it makes perfect sense. And when you see these arguments, it just they don't make sense to me. I wish people would be more open-minded about it. I wish they'd talk to young people about it. As well, to point out, Eric, like, there's lots of 16, 17-year-olds who say, oh no, I don't think I'm old enough to vote. It's a conversation we need to have, because voting doesn't have to be an inherently adult thing to do, or an inherently inherently mature thing to do. Like, it doesn't have to be this thing that's placed on a pedestal, where you have to be, like, incredibly educated and knowledgeable to be able to vote. Everyone should vote, because these people at the end of the day run the country and make decisions that affect each and every one of our lives. So I can't wait for the day that 16 and 17-year-olds can vote. I think personally the best way to do it would be to trial it in the 2024 local and European elections. Give them the vote, reduce it to 16. You wouldn't have to do it by a constitution then. You could do it by legislation through the Dáil and the Seanad. See how it goes. We can prove to people that it's not going to, the world isn't going to fall apart. We're not going to wake up in the morning and have Longford County Council or Carlow County Council run by the Communist Party of Ireland. Not going to happen. It's not going to have a drastic effect. It will just empower young people to have a say in society, and give them the voice that they already have, and elevate it. I really want to see it happen, definitely.
Yep, I think it is the necessary next step when it comes to voting and allowing people to vote. Yeah, I think you put it perfectly there. And in terms of another argument you hear, when it comes to people denying that young people should be able to vote, you hear, I think a flaw with the argument when it comes to restricting the suffrage is that there are a lot more types of people who are probably, I would argue that the democratic right of voting should be available to all citizens regardless of their view. But if you're going to go with a restriction narrative, if we're going to formulate a criterion to allow people to vote and not allow people to vote, surely there are more pressing factors than your age. Surely there are more problematic factors than your age. And I would argue there should be no factor. But the fact it's centered on youth, I think it's a fair of what could possibly amount to. And the implications argument as well, that young people don't suffer the implications. Well, they're going to, firstly, and they do in an array of different ways, especially when it comes to an array of different issues. So I think it could be really good. And lastly, I will say, in terms of the education point, there needs to be substantial reform when it comes to political education in school. And if there was substantial reform, it would make the case even more for the suffrage to be extended to young people. They should be able to vote. And if this occurs, I think it'll be better. So I don't think we should completely ignore that issue when it comes to political education in school, how it needs to be reformed, how I know there's politics in society, but CSP at junior cert level, I think there could definitely be improvements made to it to allow people to learn more about politics. Because if people are leaving secondary school not knowing much, a lot of the adults themselves don't know too much about how Parliament works. And this is partly, in my opinion, due to flaws in how we teach it at school level. So people need to learn all of the fundamentals. And this will not only benefit young people, I think it will benefit older people too. So yes, this is Luke and my positions on the great debate.
Definitely. And with that great debate, Eric, that brings us to the end of this episode, the 6th episode of the Political Incorrectors. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate it on Apple Podcasts or subscribe to it on whatever platform you use. If it's on YouTube, like it. Share it with a friend. Tell us what you think. Tell us what you think about Vote of 16, the great debate. Let us know. We will see you very soon for another episode. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening. Thank you to our producer, Nicholas Madden, and to Shad Osa, who made our lovely theme music. We bid you farewell. Thanks for listening. See you soon. Bye.
Sayonara, folks.